All right, so we've got this pile of research and articles, and it's all about autism.
Okay.
Specifically, something called autistic shutdown, which
Mhm.
seems to be, pretty heavily featured on a site called Cheap ABA.
Okay.
So that's going to be interesting to dive into.
Right.
But the big question for this deep dive is like, what is autistic shutdown? Like, what's actually happening?
Right.
Why does it happen? And then, what can be done about it?
Well, it's one of those things that is unfortunately often misunderstood, even by,
Yeah,
people who are close to people who are autistic. And it's important to remember that shutdown is not a choice.
right.
It's not it's an involuntary response.
Yeah, and Cheap ABA uses some pretty strong language. They talk about
Hmm.
feeling frozen, disconnected, even a need to flee.
Yes.
That's pretty intense.
It is. It is. And I think while those descriptions can be really powerful,
Mm-hmm.
it's helpful to kind of understand the what's happening underneath.
Yeah.
Essentially, you can think of shutdown as the nervous system hitting an emergency brake.
Oh,
So it's a
okay.
protective response to just too much
Mm-hmm.
sensory and emotional input.
So it's not a tantrum. It's not a manipulation tactic.
Exactly.
Like, I think there's sometimes that misconception.
Yeah, and it's really important to understand that distinction.
Yeah.
Now, Cheap ABA lists 4 main triggers for shutdown, and you've probably heard of these before.
Okay.
Sensory overload, emotional regulation struggles,
Right.
trauma, and social anxiety.
Yep. Got it.
But what's fascinating is how often these overlap and kind of feed into each other.
Yeah, it's like a perfect storm situation.
It is. It is.
Like, you could imagine, okay, someone has experienced trauma, maybe related to some social situation in the past,
Right.
bullying or just feeling misunderstood,
Mhm.
and then
Right.
that past trauma could then make them much more sensitive to sensory overload
Right.
in a similar setting
Absolutely.
and make shutdown even more likely.
That's a great example
Yeah.
of how those triggers can interact.
Yeah.
Um, and it highlights why understanding each person's specific situation is so important.
Yeah.
What might seem like a minor annoyance to one person
Right.
could be absolutely overwhelming for somebody on the autism spectrum,
Absolutely.
especially if they're already carrying the weight of those past experiences.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about, Cheap ABA's description of sensory overload.
Yeah.
They use the example of a busy shopping mall,
Oh, yeah.
the fluorescent lights, the crowds, the loudspeaker announcements. I mean,
Uh-huh.
I can feel my anxiety rising just thinking about that. So
Right. And now imagine experiencing that with like
yeah,
a heightened sensitivity
yeah,
on a, regular basis.
right.
It's no wonder that shutdown can become a way to cope.
Yeah, and I can see how those emotional regulation struggles can just, add fuel to the fire. Like,
Mhm.
if you're already having a hard time processing your emotions, and then you're hit with this sensory overload,
Right.
like a double whammy.
Exactly. It's like your internal resources are already stretched thin, and then
Yeah.
you're asked to deal with even more.
And then you add in, the social anxiety
Hmm.
on top of the sensory overload, on
Mhm.
top of the potential emotional dysregulation, and it's like, that's gotta be a
Mm.
recipe for shutdown, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
The pressure to mask, to kind of suppress autistic traits and try to fit in socially
Yeah.
can be incredibly draining.
Yeah.
It's like constantly trying to decipher a complex social code
Right.
while simultaneously feeling like you're under a microscope.
I never really thought about that masking thing that deeply before.
Oh yeah.
But that sounds
Yes.
it's a very good comparison.
Like wearing a costume that
Yes.
doesn't quite fit.
Right.
Yeah.
And for some autistic individuals, shutdown can become a way to escape the pressure
Hmm.
of that masking.
To retreat from a world that feels constantly demanding and overwhelming.
It's like their brain is just saying, "Okay, time out."
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's crucial to remember that this isn't about, being antisocial or wanting
Mm.
to avoid people altogether.
Right.
It's about needing a break from the intensity
Yeah.
of social interaction, from the constant effort of trying to navigate
Hmm.
a world that isn't always designed with their needs in mind.
So it's really about having that compassion and understanding for what's happening during shutdown.
Absolute.
It's not about judging the behavior. It's
Right.
about recognizing that there's an underlying struggle happening.
Exactly. And that understanding is really the first step toward creating a more supportive and inclusive environment
Yeah.
for autistic individuals.
Okay, so we've talked about what triggers shutdown. We've kind of started to recognize the signs,
Well,
but what can someone DO, like if they're feeling shut down coming on, or if they're kind of in the middle of it?
right. That's where those coping strategies come in.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that everyone's needs are different.
Okay.
What works for one person
Right.
might not work for another.
So there's no magic bullet here.
There isn't,
Yeah.
but there are some common themes.
Cheap ABA talks about taking a break, like stepping away from whatever's causing that overload, finding a safe space. I
Yeah.
mean, that seems pretty intuitive.
It is, but the key is understanding what safe space and break actually mean
Right.
for that specific person.
Yeah, yeah.
For some, it might be, a quiet, dimly lit room with sensory soothing items like a weighted blanket
Yeah.
or noise-canceling headphones.
I've heard those can be really helpful.
Yeah, for others, it might be engaging in a repetitive, calming activity.
Oh, like is that what stimming is?
Exactly.
Okay. Like fidgeting or rocking?
Yeah.
Okay.
Stimming can take many forms,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a natural way for autistic people to manage sensory input and regulate their emotions.
So it's not something to be discouraged?
Definitely not.
Even if it, it looks a little different to people who don't understand it.
Absolutely not. It's a valuable coping mechanism.
Okay.
And there are other strategies too, like grounding techniques.
Grounding techniques.
Yeah, things that help bring someone back to the present moment
Oh, okay.
and reconnect with their body.
Like what kinds of things?
It could be as simple as focusing on your breath,
Okay.
noticing the sensations of your feet on the ground,
Okay.
or even holding a cold object in your hand.
Interesting.
Anything that helps shift attention away from the overwhelming stimuli and back
Yeah.
to
Right.
the here and now.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how these coping strategies are very much tailored
Yes,
to the individual and their needs and preferences.
precisely. And the more we understand about these strategies, the better equipped we'll be to support autistic individuals during those moments of shutdown.
Okay, so we've talked about understanding the triggers. We've talked about recognizing the signs. We've talked about having those coping strategies ready to go.
Yeah,
But is there anything that can be done to prevent shutdown in the first place?
that's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's something we'll dive into more deeply
Okay.
as we continue exploring all of this.
Okay.
But one thing that jumps out is the importance of self-awareness and self-advocacy.
Yeah, and cheap ABA touches on that a bit.
They do.
They talk about emotional regulation skills,
Right.
setting boundaries, and seeking professional help when needed.
Exactly. And those are all valuable
Right.
pieces of the puzzle, but I think it goes even deeper than that.
Okay.
It's about recognizing and honoring your own needs
Yeah.
as an autistic person
Mm-hmm.
and communicating those needs effectively
Right.
to the people around you.
So it's not just about having coping mechanisms. It's about creating an environment
Yeah,
where those coping mechanisms are less needed.
that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
It's about proactively shaping your world to be more accommodating
Right.
to your sensory and emotional needs,
Mm-hmm.
rather than constantly reacting to overwhelm.
I can see how that would be a game changer.
Yeah,
But I imagine that's easier said than done.
it is.
Not everyone has the support or resources to really create those kinds of environments for themselves.
You're absolutely right. And that's where the broader conversation about
Yeah.
accessibility and inclusion comes in.
Okay.
How can we,
Yeah.
as a society,
Yeah.
create spaces that are truly welcoming and supportive
Right.
for autistic individuals?
Yeah.
How can we shift our mindset from one of fixing or changing to one of
Right.
understanding and acceptance?
I mean, those are
Big question.
big questions.
Yeah.
And I think we're just getting started on those.
We are.
But for now, I feel like we've laid a really solid foundation for understanding autistic shutdown.
We've explored the triggers, the coping mechanisms,
Yeah.
and the importance of self-awareness and self-advocacy.
Yeah.
But this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
There's so much more to learn
Yeah.
about this complex and often misunderstood phenomenon.
And thankfully, you've given us a ton of material
Lots to dive into.
to keep going with.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, stay tuned as we continue our deep dive into the world of autistic shutdown.
Looking forward to it. As we've been talking, I keep thinking about, how important it is to really distinguish
Yeah.
autistic shutdown from other things that might look similar on the surface.
Right, right. And we have some articles here that kind of get into those distinctions between shutdown and things like meltdowns, or even dissociation, which, I mean, to someone who doesn't know any better, they might think those are all the same thing.
They might.
But I'm guessing they're not.
Definitely not.
So help us understand those differences.
Yeah, and understanding those differences is really key for knowing how to respond effectively.
Okay.
A meltdown, for example, is often an outward explosion of frustration or overload, whereas shutdown is more of an inward retreat.
Okay, so meltdown, you're going to see like the yelling, the crying, maybe even physical outbursts.
Yeah.
And with shutdown, it's more about withdrawing, becoming non-responsive.
Exactly. And it's important to note that both meltdowns and shutdowns are involuntary responses to overwhelming stress.
Yeah.
It's not about manipulation or attention seeking.
It's just the system is overloaded.
It's about the nervous system reaching its limit.
Yeah.
And needing a way to release that pressure.
Okay, and then how does dissociation kind of fit into all of this?
Right.
I've heard that term, in relation to trauma, anxiety, but not really sure how it relates to autistic shutdown.
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
And even experts have, differing opinions on the exact boundaries between those concepts.
Okay.
But generally speaking, dissociation involves a kind of detachment from reality.
Okay.
A sense of disconnection from oneself or one's surroundings.
So like that feeling spaced out, or like you're watching yourself from outside your body?
That's one way to describe it.
Okay.
And while shutdown can involve that sense of disconnection, it's usually more rooted in that sensory or emotional overload, not necessarily a break from reality.
So it's not escaping reality itself, it's escaping the ego.
It is, exactly.
Okay.
And that's why understanding those distinctions is so crucial.
Yeah.
Because if we misinterpret shutdown as a tantrum or a willful behavior, we might respond in ways that are unhelpful or even harmful.
Absolutely. So it's not about punishing the behavior.
Right.
It's about creating that safe space and being supportive.
Exactly. It's about responding with empathy and understanding, not judgment or force.
Which makes me think about the masking that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
You were saying how exhausting it can be for autistic people to constantly be kind of hiding their true selves and conforming to these social expectations.
Yes. And several of the articles you provided really highlight the toll that masking can take.
Yeah.
It's like carrying this secret burden.
Yeah.
Always having to be on and monitoring every social cue.
Right.
Imagine, having to consciously control every facial expression, every gesture, every word you speak, all while trying to decipher these unspoken rules.
Oh, wow. That's a lot.
It is of social interaction.
It's like running a marathon in a suit of armor.
That's a great analogy. And for some, shutdown becomes almost this necessary release valve.
Right.
After prolonged periods of masking. It's like the body and mind are saying, enough is enough, we need a break.
Yeah, it's like hitting the pause button on that performance,
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings me to another fascinating aspect of these materials, the intersection of autism with other identities.
Oh, interesting.
And experiences.
So like how being autistic might be experienced differently depending on gender or cultural background.
Precisely.
Okay.
Several articles delve into, the unique challenges faced by, for example, autistic women and girls.
Okay.
Historically, autism has been underdiagnosed in females.
Oh, wow.
Partly because the diagnostic criteria were often based on observations of boys.
So there's a gender bias built in?
Unfortunately, yes.
Wow.
And as a result, many autistic women and girls have gone undiagnosed or misdiagnosed.
Which I imagine leads to a lot of, isolation, confusion.
Absolutely.
Self-doubt, all those things.
Yes, and I imagine those experiences can contribute to shutdown as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you're constantly being told you're different or, you're wrong, it's no wonder that you might want to withdraw.
Absolutely. The feeling of not belonging, of not being understood, can be incredibly overwhelming.
And it's not just about gender either.
It isn't. The articles also touch on the experiences of autistic people of color, LGBTQ plus individuals, and those from diverse cultural backgrounds.
So it's really about recognizing that autism intersects with all these other facets of a person's identity.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that understanding is crucial for providing truly inclusive and effective support.
So it's about seeing the whole person, not just autism.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. And it ties back to our earlier discussion about, individualized coping strategies.
Right.
What works for one autistic person might not work for another.
Right. No one size fits all.
And that's especially true when we consider, the intersectionality of their identities and experiences.
Makes sense.
Now, there's one more point I wanted to bring up.
Okay. Lay it on me.
Something that sparked quite a bit of debate in the materials you provided.
All right. I'm intrigued.
Well, several articles discussed applied behavior analysis.
Oh, okay.
Or ABA therapy.
Okay.
Which is often used as an intervention for autism.
Right. ABA. Yeah, I've heard that term, but I know it's kind of controversial.
It is. It certainly is.
Yeah.
Some autistic people and advocates have spoken out against ABA.
Okay.
Claiming that it can be, traumatic and harmful, particularly in its, more traditional forms.
Yeah, and I've heard those criticisms, like something about focusing too much on changing behaviors to fit societal norms rather than, accepting and supporting neurodiversity.
You hit on a key point of contention.
Okay.
Critics argue that traditional ABA often emphasizes, compliance and obedience.
Right.
Potentially suppressing natural autistic behaviors.
Yeah.
And stifling self-expression.
That sounds concerning.
So what do proponents of ABA say in response to those criticisms?
Yeah. What's the other side of that coin?
Well, they argue that, ABA can be an effective tool for teaching valuable skills, reducing challenging behaviors, and improving, quality of life for autistic individuals. Okay. They emphasize that modern ABA has, evolved significantly from its early iterations.
Okay.
Focusing more on individualized approaches, positive reinforcement, and respecting, the autonomy of the individual.
So it sounds like there's a whole spectrum
of
opinions on ABA.
Absolutely.
Ranging from, complete rejection to support.
Exactly. And it's important to recognize those diverse perspectives and approach the topic with nuance and sensitivity.
Right. It's not about taking sides.
No.
It's about understanding the complexity.
It is.
And really, the potential benefits and drawbacks of different approaches.
I would agree more.
And I think that kind of highlights the importance of informed consent.
Yes.
Really giving autistic individuals and their families the information.
Absolutely.
They need to make decisions that are right for them.
I couldn't agree more. It's about empowering people to make choices that align with their values and needs.
Which I think is a perfect segue to our final point, which is this idea of self-advocacy.
Yes.
In terms of navigating the world as an autistic person.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Self-advocacy is essential for autistic individuals to communicate their needs, assert their rights, and access the support they deserve.
And it's about finding your voice and using it.
It is.
To shape your own experience.
Precisely. And that can look different for everyone.
Right.
For some, it might involve, speaking up at meetings.
Yeah.
Or advocating for policy changes.
Right.
For others, it might be about setting boundaries with loved ones or finding ways to express their needs non-verbally.
So it's about finding what works for you and using it to create a more fulfilling life.
Exactly. And I think that's a message that resonates far beyond, the topic of autistic shutdown.
Right.
It's a message that applies to all of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Regardless of neurotype or identity.
Beautifully said.
Thank you.
And I think that's a perfect kind of transition to the last part of our dive here.
Right.
We've explored so much about autistic shutdown already.
We have.
The triggers, the coping strategies, the importance of understanding and acceptance.
Yes.
But I know there's still more to uncover.
There is.
Right.
We've only just begun to scratch the surface of this complex and fascinating topic. But I'm confident that by continuing to, explore these resources together, we'll gain even deeper insights into the world of autistic shutdown.
Okay.
And how we can all create a more inclusive and supportive world for neurodivergent individuals.
One thing that's really kind of stuck with me as we've been going through this stuff is the power of language
Oh, interesting.
Even within, these articles, research papers, I've noticed there are different ways people talk about these experiences.
Yeah, it's a great observation, and it really speaks to the evolving understanding of autistic shutdown. Some sources use terms like autistic burnout or autistic fatigue, which might suggest a more chronic, long-term state of exhaustion, as opposed to that more immediate, acute nature of shutdown.
So it's fascinating how those subtle shifts in language can actually reflect.
They do.
These different perspectives on what people are going through.
Absolutely. It's not just semantics. It's about how we conceptualize and frame these complex realities.
It really underscores, I think, the importance of just being mindful of the language we use.
It does.
And being open to hearing how different individuals describe their own experiences.
Absolutely.
What resonates with one person might not resonate with another.
Right.
And that's totally fine.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about respecting those individual preferences and avoiding generalizations, recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all way
to
describe or understand autistic shutdown.
And this emphasis on individual agency and autonomy, that's another thing that comes up a lot in these materials.
It does. It's not about imposing external solutions or trying to fix autistic people. It's about empowering them to make their own choices and advocate for their own needs.
Yeah, it makes me think back to our conversation about coping mechanisms.
Right.
It's not enough to just offer this list of strategies.
It's not.
It's really about creating that space where autistic individuals feel comfortable, exploring those options, choosing what works for them.
And respecting their decisions about how they want to manage their shutdowns. Some might prefer to retreat to a quiet space.
Right.
While others might need more active support or intervention.
It's about meeting people where they're at.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And providing that support that's truly individualized and responsive to their unique needs and preferences.
And it makes me think of that broader concept of neurodiversity.
Yes.
Which we touched on, and that perspective really emphasizes that neurological differences are natural variations.
They are.
Not deficits or disorders.
Right.
To be cured.
It's about celebrating those differences.
Yeah.
And recognizing the unique strengths and contributions of autistic people.
I love that framing.
Me too.
It's really about creating a more compassionate and inclusive world.
It is.
For everyone, where differences are not just tolerated, but they're valued.
Yes.
And celebrated.
I think that's a beautiful vision.
Yeah.
To strive for.
It's about shifting our mindset from one of fixing or changing to one of understanding, accepting, and supporting.
Well said. And it ties back to the importance of self-advocacy.
Right.
Which we discuss in the context of, coping with shutdown.
Right.
But self-advocacy is also about shaping a world
that
is more accommodating to neurodiversity, advocating for policies and practices that create a more inclusive and equitable society.
So it's not just about navigating the world as it is. It's about
changing the world.
Yeah, working to change it for the better.
And that can involve everything from, raising awareness about autism, advocating for accessible spaces, to challenging societal norms and fighting for disability rights.
That's inspiring.
It is.
It reminds us that we all have a role to play in this.
We do.
In creating a more just and equitable world for neurodivergent individuals.
Absolutely. And as we conclude this deep dive, I hope you feel empowered to continue exploring these topics.
Yeah.
Engaging in these conversations that challenge assumptions and promote understanding.
Me too. I mean, we've uncovered so much about autistic shutdown, the science behind it, the lived experiences of autistic people.
Yes.
And this really crucial need to create a more inclusive and supportive world.
Absolutely. And remember, this is just a starting point.
Right.
There's a whole world of information and resources out there waiting to be discovered. So keep asking questions. Keep learning. Keep sharing your own experiences and insights.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of autistic shutdown.
It is fascinating.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.